We are live. Welcome everyone to the Art of Game Mastery's Finding Paths stream. I'm John. This is my co-host Jack, and I did it the wrong side. Oh no, I didn't. I did the right side. Cool. So today is a bit of an interesting one. We actually didn't originally plan to do this one today, but some discussions came up in some private channels, and I thought that it'd be a good idea to talk about Pathfinder 2E's 3-action system, also sometimes known as the 3-action economy. It's to most people, to the general consensus of the community, it's kind of the I want to say the most prolific aspect of the system, and probably the most revered aspect. And before we get into the meat and potatoes of this episode, where we talk about how it's designed to be used and how to best utilize it and how to best take advantage of what it offers, I think it would behoove us to explain what the 3-action economy is for those of you who are watching who are not familiar with Pathfinder 2E, or maybe are familiar but just kind of learning the ropes. But before we can do that, we actually have to take a further step back and describe how in other editions, like both previous editions like Pathfinder 1E as well as D&D 3.5E, as well as other editions like D&D 5th edition, how the systems work there before we can really appreciate how the things that Pathfinder 2E did is unique and beneficial to the players. So I'm going to let Jack explain how 3.5E and Pathfinder 1E work, since they have a lot more familiarity with those systems than I do. So yeah, why don't you tell us how the movement and action system worked in those editions, Jack?
Hey guys, how's it going? So 3.5 and Pathfinder are very similar. I can only think of like one person I know who would disagree greatly with that. So one of the things that kind of started off with 3-action economy being such a big deal is that right around the end of 2nd edition, it became...
First edition.
I would say around the end of 2nd edition, before 3.5.
Oh, you mean D&D 2nd edition?
Right.
Okay, gotcha. Misunderstood.
Is when action economy became really huge. There might have been a peak for first, but I was way too young for that. But around the end of 2nd edition, right before 3rd came out, action economy became a big deal about tactics and figuring out what the other side could dish out. And so when 3.5 came out, I feel like it was already growing off of that. And 3.5 kind of had the dawn of the reaction. It was really pertinent to the game, having those reactions, giving yourselves combat reflexes, and some like the more pertinent feats, like combat reflexes that gave you those attacks of opportunity, and then didn't limit your attacks of opportunity. And attacks of opportunity is kind of important. I'm sure, John, you'll cover that later. So having reactions was a huge deal. It greatly changed the tide of combat, because during your turn, all you could really do was move and attack. And they weren't really broken down until 3.5, when they started calling them by different names, kind of breaking down what those actions were, if they were a standard action, or if they were considered a swift or a free action.
Or a move action, right? Wasn't move its own unique action in 3.5 as well?
Move was considered its own action, and it is greatly limiting. If you could successfully trip somebody, a trip was kind of devastating. Your full action would have to be, if you wanted to stand up and move, that would have been a dedicated full action. And so a lot of these actions have kind of always existed, and they've been at the forefront of 3.5 and Pathfinder 1st edition. And this is where I feel that, I want to hand this over to John, that those actions kind of got swept by the wayside.
Yeah, so before we get into 5th edition and how it kind of evolved out of that, Starfinder, which is Paizo's kind of bridge system that was in between Pathfinder 1E, which was more akin to D&D 3.5E, and then Pathfinder 2E. So it kind of is a system that takes a lot, or still maintains a lot of things from Pathfinder 1E and D&D 3.5E, but also introduces a lot of things that then became the foundation for Pathfinder 2E. So it's kind of like a hybrid system, so to speak. And I believe in Starfinder they kept the standard action, move action, swift action combo that was prolific in the D&D 3 third edition era.
some things they did in Starfinder that were just so nuanced. I mean, it's so specific to that style, like having reload being part of a move action, whereas in previous games, reloading for a crossbow or for a bow was not considered a move action. So Starfinder was kind of they're already looking out of that.
One thing I was talking about in regards to Starfinder with another one of our friends who, again, has a lot more experience with D&D 3.5 than I do, is that in Starfinder it seems that the swift action is a lot less relevant. At least it's very dependent on what your class offers you can do as a swift action. Whereas, like, for instance, when I was playing Starfinder in our friend Tramer's game, who joined us for one episode of this, where he talked about his first time GMing and whatnot. I was playing a biohacker, which is a Starfinder class that was introduced in a later supplement book. But the biohacker, at least to the point I got to, I think I got to like level 4 before I had to drop out of the game, or 3, I don't remember. But at least at that point, I didn't have any swift actions, like other than default ones that were very few that anyone could do. But then there were some classes, like I think the operator was one who had a lot of different swift actions they could do, or I don't remember which class it was. One of the classes when you guys were playing had a lot of swift action options, so it was very class dependent. And it sounds like this wasn't as much of the case in 3.5. It seems like pretty much every class had a lot of things they could do with their swift action, which made it a lot more useful. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know, but
so many feats in 3.5.
Yeah.
It was kind of your builds really depended on what you were doing, and spellcasters were constantly kind of like at a loss. And I think that they still are at this, even in the 3-action economy, with wondering what to do with if they have a bonus action or not, because spellcasters have tunnel vision. It's just, can I cast 2 spells? No. Should I cast meta magic? No. And then once they get to that position, they're like, great, what am I going to do with this bonus action? So.
Yeah. Speaking of bonus action, before we get into what the 3-action economy is, let's take a quick segue into how 5th edition does it, which I think is obviously a juggernaut in the industry right now. So 5th edition is very, very similar, I'd say, to 3.5e. Some things like nomenclature changed. Like instead of the standard action, they call it the full action now. And they kind of, you still technically have a move action, but they kind of just like bake it into the full action. Like with your full action, you can move and do a thing. So it's kind of this, it's basically the same thing. They just kind of reworded it. You no longer have the swift action, but you have this thing called a bonus action, which is effectively the same thing. Some class get use out of a bonus action, some don't. Some, I'd say the one difference between like 5e swift action, 5e's bonus action and like Starfinder's swift action is that in Starfinder there are things that everyone can do with their swift action. They're limited and they're very situational. But in 5e, you don't even get a bonus action unless your class tells you get a bonus action or can do this kind of deal. So that's kind of one difference there. Other than that, it's mostly the same old, And I think when Paizo was developing Pathfinder 2e, they recognized the limitations that such a system, instituted. And that is that it naturally leads to a less mobile, a less dynamic combat. You typically, in those kind of games, you will typically just, at the very beginning of combat, your first turn, you'll position yourself where you want to be positioned. And for the most part, most people will just stay there the rest of combat. And the rest of the turns, they'll use their full action to either attack or do something like use an item, like a potion or something. And that's it. Like it's a very static, non-dynamic combat. I'd argue it's rather boring, and I find that unfortunate given that, D&D and Pathfinder, these styles of tabletop RPGs came out of war games where things like strategy and tactics and creativity and critical thinking were paramount, and being able to, like, losing the ability to do a lot of these things that you could do in like 1st and 2nd edition, albeit a lot less structured. Like 1st and 2nd edition's action economy was not very well defined. Like it was a lot more freestyle, I guess you could say. So
We kind of skipped over fourth edition, which is kind of
Yeah, I
funny.
skipped over fourth edition because I never even really read about. I don't know anything really about fourth edition. I know it uses these things called
I played
action
it.
points. Were very video game esque, but I
I
don't know how they work. Are you familiar with
Yeah,
how it works?
yeah.
Okay.
Actually, I played a few fourth edition games, and I'm kind
Yes,
of with
AOS brought up. No one talks about D&D online, and I think
true.
okay. So I'm not sure which. There was a D&D online video game, but there also with fourth edition there was kind of the predecessor to like D&D Beyond, where they made it. Or yeah, okay. So you're talking about fourth edition. Yeah, there was this like it was effectively a crude virtual tabletop that was created by Wizards of the Coast that was released along with 4E. So 4E was designed from the get go to be very video gamey, right? And to facilitate that, they released this kind of crude, not very good virtual tabletop in the early days, and they eventually shut it down and whatnot. But yeah, that kind of like speaks to the design philosophy of that game, and it wasn't very well received in the community. And that's kind of why with fifth edition they went kind of the other direction with it. But I'll let you continue, Jack. Jack, how does fourth edition work, action economy wise?
I got into fourth edition through their board games, which is uh, whatever works, whatever sells, right? They had a lot of board games during the fourth edition era, and it was an easy segue to another friend of mine who ran a lot of fourth edition. So their action economy was extremely fixed, extremely streamlined. Like we're talking, you moved, and then you had three options. You had a like a signature ability that I forget what the specific word was for that kind of power, but it was something you could use indefinitely, like a cantrip. But it would also be like if you were a fighter, it would be your double strike kind of thing. Like those are your staples. Then they had your once in a counter and then once a day abilities. There's three types of abilities. That's it. Move and those abilities.
Well, how did
It
the
was
action point system fit into that?
action point.
Yeah,
I
I
don't.
know in fourth edition the big thing of it was there was this resource called an action point that you kind of utilize to do your abilities. And maybe it wasn't the case in the board games, but in the actual tabletop RPG, I know it's a thing because I know Matt Colville talks about how much he loved that idea.
Don't remember having action points. We
Okay.
had healing surges. That was kind of a big deal. It was. I think it's kind of like what inspiration and hero points turned into the
Mm-hmm.
healing surge mechanic. It was kind of like I feel like it also was like what turned into Resolve for Starfinder.
Starfinder, yeah.
They had the healing surge. That was. I'll have to find out what this action thing is. I have all the books.
Yeah, again,
Um,
I've never played like or even looked at the rule book for fourth edition, so uh, take whatever I say with a grain of salt. I just know that that's kind of the thing that Matt Colville raves about when he talks about 4E, because Matt Colville loves 4E, and he's like the one guy on the planet who loves 4E apparently. But
I think that it did a good job of combat. It was very restrictive. Like it was like playing Final Fantasy Tactics.
yeah,
If anyone's played the tactics games, it is very very gamey. And if that's what you like, then I mean, power to you guys. But as far as having an action economy, you knew exactly what your enemy was going to do. Every turn, they were going to do one thing for sure.
yeah,
And that's kind of the point that to talk about like what the three action economy is. In 3.5, starting at level 1, you could potentially with if you were fighting somebody who had one weapon in their hand, they were probably only going to do one attack on their turn unless they didn't need to move. They would turn that attack into two if they didn't need to move. And you were looking at like maybe a monk. I heard you were interested in playing one of those. But
yeah. It
starting
seems
out,
fun in Pathfinder too.
could
Unlike
possibly
in
dip
like games like 5e, I thought Monk and 5e was kind of boring personally, but um,
they could potentially dish out at the beginning of level 1. They could potentially dish out 3 to 4 hits
yeah,
with a flurry of blows, and that was kind of pertinent to deciding like how many attacks, right? Because when we look at other editions, take from fourth only doing one ability each round. Fifth edition is pretty much the same thing up until a certain level. So
yeah.
its actual economy kind of scales, right? Would you say like fifth level is when they get the second attack? Most martial characters.
No, I wouldn't say most martial characters. Only actually a couple get a second attack, but yeah, it's
I think
typically around
several
fifth
get a
level
third
that they
attack.
get it. What
Isn't
was
there
that?
several? Isn't there several that get a third
Well, I
attack?
know fighter gets it, ranger gets it. I think that's it.
Paladin. I know Paladin gets
Oh
their
yeah,
second
paladin
attack.
gets it. You're right.
We had a Paladin in our Mines of Fandelver game that
Yeah.
had their second attack.
But yeah, it's always fifth. It's always level 5. If you can get an extra attack, it's level 5. Now fighter also gets the action surge bonus action, which is pseudo. It's technically another attack, but it's a lot more restricted on when you can use it.
The fighter's action surge. I really like that dynamic. Not gonna lie.
Yeah.
But so as far as scaling is concerned, 3.5. I told you like level 1, there was usually one attack you were doing, and if you were dual wielding, you had that first attack, and your second attack was that like if you didn't take the proper feats and you heavily invested your feats, you were looking at being at -6 for your 2 attacks. And reasonably with ambidexterity and 2-weapon fighting, you could get up to your first attack with your main hand is +1 and your offhand is +0. Like at level 1, that was your base. It was pretty difficult, but the scaling is very different. A level 20 fighter was consistently dishing out 4 to 5 attacks every single round.
It's the same thing in 5th edition. 5th edition, a fighter, and I think this is pretty unique to a fighter, but by level 20, they can do, I think, like 5 attacks a turn or something like that, which is in 5th edition, which is already so one of the ubiquitous problems with 5th edition, and the reason that almost all adventure path, like official adventure paths, stop at like level 10 or 11 is because after like level 11 or 12, the math of 5th edition falls apart, and you start to have major balance issues. And then the fact that fighters can get like 5 attacks only adds to that, in my opinion. But whatever, that's fine. Most games don't go beyond that anyway, even if they are homebrew. So, But
the same problem in 3rd edition. However, I never got to go to the higher levels in 4th, but reportedly, I have heard that 4th edition, because it's so gamey, it actually is balanced all the way across the board.
I could see that. So we talked about 3rd edition, 3.5, Pathfinder 1E. We've talked a little bit about 4th edition, and we've spoken about 5th edition. So how does Pathfinder 2E's third action economy differ from that? Well, instead of having these like different types of actions that you can just you can do certain things in this type of action, certain things in this type of action, etc., etc. Pathfinder 2E, I would argue, streamlined it, and just said, okay, everyone gets 3 actions by default, and you can do whatever actions you have of it at your disposal. You have 3 actions to do whatever you need to do. Yeah, 3 action points. That's a great way of putting it, Eos, is you have 3 action points. Most things like attacking, moving, attacking again, for instance, and take 1 action, right? Most spells, though not all of them, are 2 actions. And then you have this kind of plethora of things called skill actions, which some of them are you can do whether you're trained in a skill or not. Others require you to be some degree of proficiency in that skill to utilize, right? And this is kind of the crux of where I'm going to be going personally with this discussion, is that I don't think a lot of players and a lot of game masters take proper advantage of those skill actions. And I think that a lot of combats, both on the player side and the game master side, fall into a trap of, well, we'll get to that when we get there. But Illa says a PC responsible for their actions and consequences, not even once. Again, I don't think it's just a player thing. I think game masters are just as guilty of this as well. And I'll actually argue later on that a game master who takes advantage of this will actually make it easier for players to take advantage of it. But again, we'll get there later. So I want to make sure everyone's clear on what the action economy is, and that's you have 3 actions. Think of them as action points, whatever, and everything in the game takes some number of actions, from either 1 to 3, and then things like haste can give you an extra action that can be used for specific things, for instance.
Quicken state, which could make the elusive 4 action economy.
Right, but again, but typically things like haste, they'll restrict what you can do with that fourth action. For instance, like in the case of haste, you can either stride or strike. I think is the two options you have.
Right. If you gain the quickened condition,
Yeah,
it
which
doesn't have,
basically
usually
haste is what
doesn't
gives
have
you.
caveats, but in most cases we see they seem to hell have caveats.
Um, where's I going with this? Oh, so we now we talked about what the three action economy is. Um, I think that one of the problems. So as I mentioned at the very beginning of this is like the most revered aspect of Pathfinder 2 within the community. Like you go on any of the Pathfinder 2e Reddits or Facebook pages or whatever, and you'll be hard pressed not to find a number of people raving about this system, right? The problem I see with it is that, Pathfinder 2e is a new novel system, right? It's very different than previous other systems. And because of that, you typically have people coming into this system from other systems naturally, right? Whether they're coming from Pathfinder 1e or 3.5e, or they're coming from 5th edition, or they're coming from different games entirely, like Fate or Call of Cthulhu or whatever, right? The game they're coming from typically has some sort of, like, leaves the player with some sort of the precognitions of what they expect the system, how they expect the system to work. You'll often see that people coming from games like 3.5e or 1e or 5th edition even will try to play the game as if they were playing those games. So they're still using the three action economy. They're still using, an action to attack, an action to move, a couple actions to cast a spell. But you'll notice they're a lot less creative. Typically, not always. They're a lot less creative with that economy. I often see people coming from these systems, and this, like I said, this isn't just players, this is game masters as well. They don't typically think often enough to consider different things they could do, whether that's skill actions, whether that's basic actions, like different basic actions. And I think that this leads to confusion, and it even leads some people to think that the system isn't great or it's confusing or whatever. And but then, like, some people I've noticed who come from like more indie RPGs, like maybe they've played D&D, but they also have experience in other games like Fate, for instance, which has these kind of really weird rules for like creating an advantage and all that stuff that we'll come back to shortly, because I think it actually is important in playing into how Pathfinder 2e's action economy is designed. They tend to pick up on it a lot quicker. And I think that, now again, I don't think this is a fault of anyone. I think it's just an interesting data point that it seems to be that people who have experience with games outside of your typical D&D or Pathfinder games have a different way of thinking, I guess, than other people. And I think that Paizo, I mean, it's obvious that Paizo, the developers of Pathfinder, play other games as well. They've come out on record to say this all the time, right? Yes, ALS, that's a good point, and something I'm going to actually get to here shortly is that Fate is extremely flexible. Some could argue at times it's a little too flexible. D&D is historically a lot less structured, or a lot more structured, rather. Pathfinder 2 is kind of in between that. And I think that you'll notice once I get to my analogy later on about Fate, you'll see that there's a lot of similarities between the two that might not be immediately obvious. So, Jack, what are your thoughts on this? Do you have similar experiences when you run your games, or?
So I've been jumping into a lot of different people's games lately, and I've also been coaching a lot of fresh people who are completely new to the system. And for the first time, I got to introduce some people to Pathfinder, not coming from any other system. So that is a rare treat, right? Most people who come into Pathfinder usually are going to have played D&D and they're going to chew right through it. They're going to want something crunchier, and they're going to move on to, that's how they're going to come into this.
But these are people who have never played a tabletop RPG before.
Right. Every now and then you get that lucky, you meet that person who just so happens to like role play and is like, oh, well, I've never played D&D or Pathfinder. And you're like,
I mean,
Bring 'em
we
in.
were all there at one point in our lives, right? Whether what system that was might be different, but at some point, all of us started somewhere. So
Right, Pathfinder was first edition was brand new when I
yeah,
came into 3.5. So I have been looking at this kind of lens over time since Action Economy is it's a constantly growing terminology over the 20 plus years that I've been playing this game, and so I have kind of always watched like how GMs, DMs, and story keepers are handling the approach, and I feel like maximizing the use of the action economy is like increasing the difficulty. If there's a difficulty slider in any game, say like the Elder Scrolls games, the single player ones, where you can adjust the difficulty, that is exactly what the action economy is. From the GM's perspective, if you start maximizing all of the different actions that your monsters, your bad guys can do, it's going to make the game a heap more difficult for the players.
definitely.
If,
If they're
and,
not also taking advantage of these
right.
things as well, yeah.
And so I did my own personal tests on some of these occasions where I had encounters that were built pretty much the same and the party was the same level between two different encounters. And I followed this, style of play where like the enemies were going to move, they were going to attack, and if they needed to move again or attack a second time, they would, and they would fish for crits.
Mm-hmm.
And the party steamrolled this encounter. Absolutely steamrolled the encounter. Follow the same style with a different encounter, but this time the enemies were doing a lot of different athletic based abilities to kind of trip, crowd control. They were running away as needed. They were gaining that stealth. They were using a lot of different actions,
Mm-hmm.
and I completely steamrolled the party.
Yeah.
And I felt really bad, and I was like, "Oh man, I got to pull back because this is way too much too soon for them." And I just wanted to gauge personally to see what that looked like in a combat. If you start pulling out all the stops and using those tactics of 3 action economy, it can turn the difficulty mode from hard to insane.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so, player side of things, I think we kind of barely touched this on about 5th edition versus like Pathfinder 2E. I feel like 3.5. There's another part of action economy that I need to cover about summons and mobs. Don't let me forget that. But between the two, 5th edition and 2nd edition, Pathfinder was. Oh man, I lost my train of thought. Darn. What was I talking about?
So you're talking about how you're trying two different approaches to combat with the same adventure, and how like as you start to pull out all the stops and start using different skills as a game master, it gets a lot harder on the players. And
combat trail. There is kind of an individual basis in 5th edition. Like you are the hero, right? And so your action economy is kind of based around you being heroic. Whereas oddly enough, in a game like Pathfinder, where you have hero points, it feels more like the party is the group themselves are the heroes. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So I don't feel like there is the same kind of mechanics available in 5th edition to do that kind of teamwork that requires a good assist to lure out and score.
And that's
I
exactly the analogy I wanted to make with a game like Fate.
The Fate goes above and beyond
Yeah.
with that ability. Like I can't even process how many options there are in Fate.
But
But when you look at Pathfinder, it's codified in there. Sorry to use your word there, Alos, but it's like codified in there. Like, hey, you circumstance bonuses, item bonuses, these different penalties that you're going to deliver. When you start using those tactics, you can push the enemy back and destroy their action economy because now they have to move. And if the monster has to move, it normally would have had 3 actions to use on you, whereas you don't get that same benefit in 5th edition. The monster was always going to move; it always had that move.
Mm-hmm.
So it has a flexibility now.
It's a lot more of an economy and less of a. I don't even know what you would call the other.
I don't even know what to call it. Alos, what do you think it's called? So that was my opinion on the difference between some of the older editions on action economy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a good point in that, as I mentioned, a lot of people coming from previous editions, they're used to just spending their full turn attacking or doing something else. They don't often consider that sometimes you can attack and do something else, right? That's kind of the best thing about the 3 action economy is that you're not super restricted in what you. Now there are some limitations that kind of indirectly influence you, like indirectly restrict you. In that, for instance, you in the rules of Pathfinder 2e, you can't stack multiple bonuses or penalties of the same type. So, for instance, flat-footed is a popular employed condition that it can be obtained in a number of different ways. And because it's always a circumstance bonus or circumstance penalty, you can't stack any other circumstance penalties, including itself. You can, however, stack a circumstance penalty like flat-footed with a status penalty like
Fear, demoralize.
Fear's a good one, actually. I think fear's a status penalty. So, yeah, so like frightened, right? You could stack the benefits of frightened and flat-footed. So there are some like inherent limitations in the system, and I've actually had one friend of ours argue that because flat-footed is so important and there's so many ways to get it, you often end up kind of feeling like, okay, you know, I already have flat-footed, so now what do I do? Because all my options I can do just give me flat-footed, which, depending on how you build your character and how you play your character, could be a concern. I agree with that. But I'd argue if you build or play your character like that, you're probably not doing it correctly anyway.
Thank you. Atlas literally covered exactly my point, was that, oh, you already have flat foot, your job's not done. Okay,
Yeah.
Once you provide flanking in Pathfinder, your job is not done. And if you think that all
For
my
instance,
abilities
if you didn't take trained in
automatically,
athletics, for instance, right, and you were,
it's your fault.
yeah, that's what I was getting at. Is like if you kind of put yourself in a corner like that, that's your own fault, and you probably, you know, you live and learn, right? Like, it is what it is. Next time, be smarter with your build choices. But that said, I agree with your idea that Pathfinder 2e is less a game about each individual party member dishing out the most damage, being the center of attention all the time, right? It is much more a game that is more similar to a game like Fate, where you have somebody, you know, each member of the party should be good at, like, really good at one thing, right? And those things should complement each other. You know, you try not to stack. Like, if you have somebody who's really good at dishing out a massive amount of damage, well, you probably don't want to have multiple party members who are like that. You might have one extra person, right? As kind of a backup. But you typically don't want to have the whole party just focused on doing as much damage as possible. Instead, you want you if you're not the person who is, like, if you're not the fighter, for instance, right? Fighters are typically the guys who are doing the most damage, or the rogue who's just dishing out mad sneak attack damage if playing right. If you're not one of those people, you might actually, or yeah, barbarian would be another example. But you might actually, so if you try to maximize, if you try to just attack every turn, right, and even say you hit every turn, right, you are not. If you hit every turn and the fighter hits every turn, the fighter is going to do more damage, just period. So you're actually better off, if you're not one of those kind of massive damage spike classes, to use a skill action or a spell or something that gives a condition, or something that gives a bonus to the fighter, who then is going to have a higher chance to hit, which they're going to have anyway from you because that's their shtick. B, if they have a higher chance to hit, that also means they naturally have a higher chance to crit. And the fact that crits in Pathfinder 2e are not just natural 20s, like they are in other editions, right? They also have that sliding 10 over scale. And that was a deliberate choice, by the way. That was the idea, that you're supposed to be getting bonuses to your attacks so that you have a higher chance to crit.
Speaking of that, John, I noticed a funny. I think this was the reason we had this conversation in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Was because once we played Pathfinder 2e and we tried to go back to some of the different editions, we were constantly thinking in our head, like, "Oh, we're hitting 10 over. This should be a critical."
Yeah.
And we were constantly thinking that. Like, once you play with that kind of mode on, where it feels like there's an actual accuracy dynamic to it, it was really hard to not think it every single time in every other game that I've played since then.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, it's very good fit for Pathfinder 2e because it has this idea that, well, for one, support characters are an actual thing in this game, unlike like 5e. Like you cannot reasonably play a good support character in 5e, which really hurts my soul. But regardless, if you you know, build up your fighter as an example in that way, then even though you're sacrificing an action that you could have attacked with, albeit you probably would have missed anyway, but even assuming you did hit,
you're just setting up.
Even though you didn't do damage that for that action, you still the overall round damage, the damage that was dished out in the entire round, all turns for your party in that combat, is typically going to be higher. And that's what you should be more concerned about. And you know, a lot of people are like, "Oh, well, you know, I want to be the hero. I want to do cool things." And I'm like, if you think of all the movies and all the books, right? You read and watch. Yes, you know, the hero doing a mad damage is fun, right? But I'd argue that the more interesting is when you have that teamwork at play and you have the group of like the whole reason you have a party in a tabletop RPG and it's not just a solo play adventure is because it's more like it's just an epic fantasy, right? Like in Lord of the Rings, if it was just Frodo, he'd be dead back in the Shire, right? If it was just Aragorn, he would have died early on as well. Like you have these people who are helping each other to reach a common goal, and each of those people in that party, in books and movies, and they should be in your games as well. Samwise could have sold it, maybe. Okay, I'd give you that one. But you know, in these books and movies, and also how it should be in your table, you're all complementing each other with your skills, right? The idea that, you know, you have some people who are good at damage, you have some people good at utility, you have some people who are good at you know, social encounters, right? You all these I hate to overload the word proficiencies, are going to help each other reach your common goal.
Roles, what you're reaching for is the different roles that is going to level up your game. Because when the party is working together as a team, instead of this individual, I scored this many shots, I did this much damage, I killed this many bad guys, which in some context is fun. It's like, take, you know, Lord of the Rings, Gimli and who's that darn elf? They were
Legolas.
Were arguing about they were talking about their kill count. When you get a party that's focused on that teamwork, all of a sudden your game is gonna transcend to a different level where they're going to be focused on passing together social interactions. They're going to be more ready to tackle mysteries. They're going to be ready to handle. Thank you. They're going to be ready to handle more than just sitting on a little scoreboard, focusing on the combat and moving the pieces.
Yeah, and I think ultimately you're going to end up with a much more interesting game as a result. And something else I want to touch on here, and something else that's kind of related here, is that I think another, and I don't think this is from previous editions, by the way. I think this is totally a precognition or pre-notion from video games, which I think a lot of people, especially those who are new to the hobby in general, come in with, is they think, oh, RPG, I've played a lot of video game RPGs, I know how this works. And, you know, in an old, or not old, I guess a previous is a better word, a previous Finding Path stream, we talked about the holy trinity of roles being, you know, the tank, the healer, the DPS, and those totally exist. But I feel like those roles are misused in tabletop RPGs. The biggest example I can think of is the tank role. So the tank role absolutely exists. However, and I think this is often more of a fault of game masters than the players, but maybe not. Oftentimes at the start of combat, the person who deems himself the tank, quote unquote, right, will run up, position themselves in front of the biggest, baddest dude they see, and stay there, and so just start wailing on them. And I think as a game master,
so boring.
We often think, okay, well, this dude's wailing on me. I'm gonna just knock him out, right? But then at the same time, you have the caster and the bat throwing spells his way. You have the rogue sneaking up behind him or sneaking off in the distance and hitting him with sneak attacks. You have the healer who's healing everyone, negating all the damage they're doing. Yet the creature still just stays there wailing on the tank. Now, unlike in video games, in tabletop RPGs, or at least Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder 2, there might be tabletop RPGs out there that does have this mechanic, but there's no idea of a taunt, right? In video games, you have this concept of a taunt, which forces the character or the creature you're engaged with to focus on you and only you, assuming you're successful. That doesn't exist in tabletop RPGs, at least not D&D and Pathfinder. More realistically, in that situation, assuming you're facing an intelligent creature, not like some instinctual beast, right? But if you're facing an intelligent creature, they wouldn't just stand there and attack the tank. They would go after the weaker enemies, who, like the healer, the caster, even the rogue, because the less people throwing attacks at them, the more they can focus on that tank and not take as much damage. They're going to knock out the tank last. Like, they're not going to stick around. They'll probably run away, which, remember, most fighters and rangers and stuff, the people who are probably going to be tanks, have attack of opportunity. So they get that free attack on them anyway. But the reason that every class doesn't get attack of opportunity, like in 5th edition, for instance, is because they expect your characters to be moving around a lot more. And I think this is a thing that is lost on a lot of game masters. And I think that because a lot of game masters don't take advantage of this movement and these extra skill actions that they could be using, it then puts the players in a state of complacency, right? They're like, well, I mean, it's not going to move, so I might as well just keep wailing on it. There's no reason for me to take these extra actions. Like, sure, I could buff up the damage of my party, but we're not really in danger, right? So it may not be the most damage possible, but it's easiest for all of us. So I think, along with what you said, Jack, you have the sliding scale of difficulty, right? If you start turning it up and start doing all this fancy stuff as a game master, you're going to make it harder on the players. Well, I'd argue that maybe you don't go full blast, right? Maybe you don't come out the gate and just pulling out all the stops, right? But somewhere in between, I think there's a sweet spot where you can entice or get the players to start being more creative, like put them in a spot where there's some tension and there's some fear for their lives, quote unquote, and that will kind of influence their decision making a bit and make them a bit more likely to start getting more creative and tactical with their approaches. I know it was a very long-winded rant, but that
Absolutely. I mean, it was pretty based and it wasn't that tangential. So you'd also covered some of the major topics that we would want to talk about: attack of opportunities. So we'd mentioned we want to talk about that, the differences between that. I've noticed a few other Pathfinder video people out there who have said this, so let's repeat that so that everybody is on the same page. GMs, stop giving all your creatures attack of opportunity. It was kind of removed to be limited to specific creatures and specific classes. Yeah. Give the opportunity to the players to reposition and move around more often.
That's not to say you should never use a attack of opportunity, right? You absolutely should throw it in there sometimes.
Sometimes. It should be treated as sprinkles on top,
right,
and not the main focus of,
right.
And it should be on every single creature. If you are building a repertoire of creatures, you're building a coterie or a party of baddies, there can be one creature that has the ability, right? Maybe the center focus, or the creature who is representing the bad side's tank.
Right.
That's a legitimate use. You have a party of 5 enemies. One of them has it. That seems pretty base. You have got 10 baddies, maybe 2 of them have it.
Yeah.
If you have every single monster of every single fight and they always have attack of opportunity, you're punishing your players in a game where they should be allowed to move around.
Yeah. And I well, first of all, Aeolus brought up a great way of saying it. Use attack of opportunity when it's opportune.
That's so clever, as usual.
So, if there are times too where you do want to like throw that difficulty scale to the max and really pull out all the stops to show your players what you can do, right? Or what this game can do. I'd say that if you want to do that, do it, but you might consider making your encounters one level lower in difficulty, like when you're designing the encounter, right? So like if you normally are planning to throw like when I say levels, first of all, I should say that in the core rule book in the encounter building section, there's this kind of idea of trivial encounters, low level encounters, or I forget the word they use there. There's moderate encounters, there's severe encounters, and there's
Totally.
forget the last one, extreme encounters, I think is it. But so that's the kind of degree of and how you build your encounters and how many monsters and what level of monsters you throw at those your players is kind of based on what degree or what level of encounter you want to throw at them. So most of the time you're going to be throwing either low level or moderate encounters at your players. If you really want to turn up your difficulty to the max, you might if you're going to throw a moderate encounter at them, throw a low level, right? If you're going to throw a severe, maybe for a boss fight, you would typically use like a severe encounter for like a scenario ending boss fight. But maybe you like gave them a lot of really cool abilities and you really just want to go ham, right? On using all those abilities, pulling out all the stops, make for a really crazy, dynamic, chaotic fight. Maybe you make the encounter moderate and level, but then you just go absolutely crazy with the tactics, right? So there's kind of like a couple knobs you can turn there to really fine tune what you're trying to go for.
Speaking of, if you're going through all this work making a character for your players to fight against, and you're trying to find something to spice up their combat, attack of opportunity is kind of cliche at this point.
Yeah.
You should be coming up with reactions that aren't attacks. That they're not attacks of opportunity. Their reactions should be anything but, for creativity's sake, because that's I'd say it's since the dawn of 3.5 attack of opportunity, it's kind of old, especially for somebody who's been playing the game for 20 years.
Yeah.
Attack of opportunity is I feel like it's not inspiring anymore. Yeah. Like it's just punishing players. It's attack of inopportunity, right? There needs to be more needs to be more abilities for them to have. Duck for cover example is a great use of those reactions.
Aid is admittedly, as a game master, I typically don't use aid as much as I probably should. I actually use it more as a player than a game master, but aid is a great alternative to attack of opportunity. You're especially if you have like a number of creatures facing the players at once. Having one of them aid the other creature, it would be quite cruel, but it would also be quite cool.
I wanted to cover one last bit about
sure.
economy, if I have chance.
Go for
John.
it.
You missed out on 3.5. Summoners were pretty overpowered. So one of the things about action economy, I think this is where from second edition, where that carryover I told you earlier about how like 3.5 was extremely focused on what the economy was going to be the most useful. Summoners, druids, they could have a zoo of creatures at their disposal. And evil clerics, I might have told you about a campaign where I played a lich and I had like an undead army. That kind of breaks action economy.
Yeah.
And I have a feeling that that's why that they, kind of broke down those uses in 4th, 5th, and Pathfinder 2nd edition, right? You never really probably saw just like what it was like having a druid who had 2 wolves at their disposal. They could flank the enemy with no problem, and if they were shapeshifting into a wolf themselves, they were being this like kind of hive mind creature where they could move in and out of the ranks as needed. The lich having an undead army, even though the undead minions kind of played out like Diablo 2 undead where they would just get swatted really quickly, your action economy was huge because you could deliver so many more things during your turn, and it was not fair to other players. Yeah. So like my turn would take 10 minutes to try to move and position all of my skeletal units. Yeah. And some of the other players who were kind of new, they're summoning a summoner, wizard, or sorcerer. A level 1 sorcerer summoner could just pop into existence for an entire round, a creature, and that changes the dynamics. And as they get higher levels, they could have more of these. Yeah, keeping track of all of them is not fun because it ends up being like a bit of a teeter totter between the player and the GM. Like, how many minions do you really have? And
Yeah.
do we need to tick off all of them if they've already acted?
Yeah, I mean, you bring up another good point too, is that as you start to get more tactical and make better use of all the available actions to you and whatnot, um, whether you're a player or a game master, and I think it's actually even harder as a game master because you're controlling more than just one character and thus have more than one turn per round, right? Is that your turns are either A, going to take longer because you have to think about a lot more, or B, you're going to have to get better at pre-planning and adapting on your plans on the fly, which I think B is the goal, right, of any player. Like, it's going to be tough at first because especially so even if you're new to the system, sure, but even if you're new to especially if you're new to tabletop RPGs in general, you're going to have a hard time, when it's not your turn, thinking about, okay, what am I going to do on my turn, and then next turn something happens where it completely aborts your strategy. Okay, what I gotta readapt here. What I'll change, and then like by the time your turn comes up, at that point, hopefully you've been keeping up with everything and you know what you're gonna do, and that at that point your turn can go quickly. But that's really hard for inexperienced players. And as a game master, now if you have an encounter with like 6 enemies in it, right? You got to be keeping track of this like every turn for all 6 enemies, and it's a pain in the ass, to be quite honest. So I get it. Like it's not easy to be optimal in this game, but I think that because these kind of games have their foundation or their history in war games, things like critical thinking, things like creativity, things like tactics, things like strategy. Those are all very fundamental to the system. And I think Pathfinder 2e did a really good job of allowing you to flex those muscles in combat. A better job than some other editions have.
2e, John?
What was that?
How do you feel about the Pathfinder summoning?
Admittedly, I have not looked super closely at the summoning stuff yet, so I don't really have an opinion on it. Though I know Aeolus is getting ready to play a summoner in Shifting Sands, and I'm really excited to see how that plays out in practice.
So like you had an action economy with Fang and
you mean the companion stuff,
right? Having companions, summons, or
I think it's brilliant how they went about it, rather than just treating them as a separate creature, like a separate turn in combat. They said, okay, this creature exists in combat. This I hate to use the word minion because in previous editions minion meant something very specific, but your companion exists in combat, but it's not, unless it's like just trying to protect itself, like something's actively attacking it, then it's not going to do anything unless you tell it to. And if you notice, every type of companion, whether it's an animal companion, whether it's undead minion, whether it's a summon, whether it's whatever, right? They all work the same way in that you have to command your companion to do something. And I like that, anybody can do this normally. You just trade one action for one action. But then like the classes and the archetypes that kind of are focused on this idea of having companions, like ranger, like druid, like cleric with their undead minions, with summoner, they get to trade one action for 2 actions, which then adds to their action economy, right? It's still technically your action economy, even though it's a different creature. It's still you, and it's really cool if you have certain feats, you can even spend 2 actions to then get 3 actions from your companion, which then it's the same number of actions as the other way in the end, but it really adds a lot of diversity to what you can do in your turn.
Between like having an independent companion, they get an extra action economy, which kind of helps break that action economy, right? Because we've seen like how the who was it, like our druid in our party, they have a companion that's independent. So they have that extra move that takes up, additional time, and then.
Oh, you mean from the feat they have that lets them move without being commanded or whatever?
The independent companion.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really cool as well.
And not to mention just spending one action to get two. Like,
Hmm.
it's, that ultimately gives you four actions in your action economy. So, I mean, you still get some, but like, take a look at. I think you're pretty. Maybe that's you're too upset to talk about fifth edition's Hunter, about how they, like Beastmaster.
Oh, well, I think Ranger in general is just. I mean, there's not even really a point in talking about it because it's like so ubiquitous. This belief is so ubiquitous, even among the 5e community. Like, it's not just me being salty about it. Like, it's even everyone who loves 5e will share this opinion that the base ranger, the ranger that's in the player's handbook for 5e, is just utter crap and useless. Especially the Beastmaster subclass. So apparently, I have not actually played this myself, but apparently, and I believe it was Tasha's Hidden Cauldron, they released a better ranger class, from what I understand. But from what I understand, it's still not great. Like it's all right. It's workable at least. I don't like the plan, but it's not great. So I know that in that advanced 5e or whatever it's called, that kind of third party supplements that pseudo sanctioned by Wizards of the Coast that basically exists to fix all the broken shit with 5e. Supposedly, it hasn't come out yet, so we'll see whether that plays out. But supposedly, they have another Ranger revision that's supposed to be even better. So again, it hasn't come out yet, so I don't know if this is true or not. But it's kind of sad that it's taken 3 attempts to make one class like usable and worthwhile. But
Okay, so in 3.5, the Ranger was amazing, and I feel like they ruined it. Like,
yeah,
maybe that's a hot take. I think that 3.5 Ranger was best because when you made that Ranger, you had all of the options at the beginning of the game, and it was up to you to pick feats to decide what kind of Ranger you wanted to be, whether you wanted to have a companion or not, whether you wanted to do Druid spells, right? Because
yeah.
I feel like Rangers not having access to spells is.
Are you talking about in 5e or in Pathfinder 2e?
3.5 was.
Right, but I'm saying the not access to spells. Are you saying because in 5e
Pathfinder
they did have
2.
access to spells, and in Pathfinder 2e they do. Yeah, they do. Actually, Rangers are technically a spellcaster in 5e. They get their spellcasting ability is Wisdom, um, but they're not as good of a spellcaster as like a cleric or
A druid.
a
Would you
druid.
compare
Yeah,
the two? They pick up the druid spellcasting.
yeah,
So the fifth edition kind of murdered their ability to have action economy, and Pathfinder doesn't really deliver as far as the spellcasting is concerned. Like, you have to like literally bring in an archetype to get actual spellcasting.
yeah. I think there's a couple feats that give you a few focus spells, but like to be an actual spellcaster, yeah, you'd have to. But I'd argue that's actually a nice thing about the system is that you don't need to build this stuff into a class to take advantage of it. You can always dip into an archetype to get whatever the hell you want. Um,
Well, that's the other thing about how I feel Ranger got really screwed in Pathfinder Second Edition. I don't feel like a dual wielding is even an option. I have yet to see dual wielding like function in.
sure, it can. I mean, Gunner does great with dual wielding. It has the feat that lets him basically. I mean, his second map is basically a -2, which is if you get
I feel like
flat-footed, it's
you're
nothing.
hitting with an offhand weapon. It doesn't deliver that feel.
But what?
It doesn't feel like you're hitting with an offhand weapon. You're doing one executed strike where you're hitting with both instead of
That's
like.
true. It does. Yeah, I agree.
Whereas before you had that offhand weapon with the like, so out the bat, a level 1 ranger could
Mhm.
have ambidexterity and 2 weapon fighting, and you would deliver one solid attack and an offhand attack, which had a little bit less accuracy but still delivered kind of
Yeah.
like
I will
there was
say that for Ranger in particular, this isn't true for every class, but for Ranger in particular, a lot of their feats that are around, like doing 2 attacks for one action or something like that, require you to be wielding a weapon in each hand. So even though it doesn't necessarily feel like you're doing 2 attacks, you are because you have to be wielding a weapon in each hand to be doing these special abilities. So um, I'd argue with Gunner in particular, it's it's kind of not a great build because I wanted to do the 2 weapon fighting, but I also wanted to do the animal companion stuff, which works in some situations, but it really limits what I can do on my turn because I'm going to be spending 1 action to command Fang, right? And they're going to get 2 actions. Awesome. Then I'm either going to be moving and attacking, or moving and doing something else, or doing something else and attacking, or I'm going to be using my only other 2 actions to do one of my 2 weapon attack feats, right? So it's I don't know. It's like it works depending on how I set myself up, but if I can't get set up, it's kind of doesn't work. So I'd argue that my build choice was probably poor with Gunner. But I think that there is a place for 2 weapon fighting rangers, though I agree with you that it feels kind of weird because there's no difference in Pathfinder 2e fundamentally from attacking twice and attacking with a different weapon in each hand. So I get what you're saying. But
So I think we covered quite a bit about the 3 action economy. Did you want to cover anything else?
I think one other thing I wanted to cover, we are going to be running over with this, but that's fine. We talked about in the past how, we aren't necessarily going to be strictly sticking to the 1 hour schedule. But one thing I wanted to mention is that when we were kind of like, the whole reason this video became what it's about is because we had, as I mentioned, we had a discussion in Discord with some of us around this very idea. And one of the players who is very new to Pathfinder 2e, when I explained this all to them, they were like, oh, well, I didn't get that impression when I was reading the core rulebook. And they suggested that Paizo should do a better job at explaining this stuff in the core rulebook. And my rebuttal to that was, well, no. I mean, as we mentioned, Pathfinder 2e is based on wargaming. And as we mentioned, one of the fundamental tenets of wargaming is creativity and critical thinking. So I think it's completely fair to expect the players of a game based around wargaming to be able to perform such critical thinking and creativity without having their hand held. And I'd argue that if they did hold your hand throughout this and suggest this is what you should do here, this is what you should do here, then it takes away a lot of the magic of the game and makes the game itself a lot less interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's basically it. Like, I don't think Paizo shoulder your hand. I think that, obviously you can play the game without playing it optimally. You're doing yourself and your party a major disservice in doing so, but it's completely possible. And it's up to you as a player to be able to figure this stuff out and think, okay, I'm in this situation. How can I make the best of it? Right. Just like if you're in real life, right? If you're a soldier in real life, whether in the medieval times or in modern day, whatever, you're going to be relied upon by your teammates to make, or, your company to make smart decisions. Now, often you'll have a leader or some kind of somebody making decisions on your behalf, but they won't always be there to make those decisions. And when you're out in the field, you're going to have to be thinking on the spot and being like, so-and-so is in this position. I don't have anyone to call the shots here. What's the best thing I could do in this particular time? I mean, I'm sure Jack, as a veteran yourself, you can, relate to this.
A veteran. Oh, that's almost a pun right there. Veteran player? Is that what you're referring to? Or
well, yeah, both.
You just did an unintentional pun. You should always intend your puns.
I knew it was coming. I was waiting for it.
But, yeah, I mean, I guess you could say, like, I've been exposed to, like, different, like, all caps and resin, like the other, like, different gases and pepper sprays and whatnot. So I guess you could say I'm a seasoned veteran.
But I mean, you get what I'm saying, right? Like, you shouldn't have a manual to hold your hand. The idea of these games is creativity and critical thinking, like at the most fundamental level. If you're not capable of doing that, what was that?
If you're wanting that kind of wargaming, I mean, D&D and Pathfinder are only simulacrums of wargaming. If you really are wanting wargaming, there's other games out there that can deliver that. and there's also like mods and the rules for that kind of wargaming.
Right.
So I think the three action economy is great because it's going to apply to all the different opportunities for like what kind of gaming you end up doing.
Right. I guess what I was getting at was more not suggesting that D&D and Pathfinder are war games, right? Because they're not. They're role playing games, but they have their roots like in wargaming. Like the original D&D 1E was based around wargaming, right? Not that it was a war game, but like that's what conceived the idea. Is like I want to be able to do some of the stuff that I did in wargaming, but also be able to not be a platoon and be a person, right? And be able to role play that person.
With people who have that platoon mentality, oh man, it makes running encounters really difficult. Right. I don't know if you've experienced that, but we were talking about the difficulty rating, and you just kind of reminded me of some group that I played with back in the military, who they all kind of fleshed out what their roles were going to be, and they all executed all of those roles. And it wasn't a whole lot of fun for me, which is kind of a first, right? Because every single doorway was like a clear, breach procedure. They would all kind of use military tactics on it, and it makes you want to be like, is the door just a door or is it a mimic door? I can't decide because I'm putting all this work into it.
At the same time, though, I think, there are, if you're wanting to play a purely narrative game or a primarily narrative game, there's also better systems for that. I think the kind of spot that D&D and Pathfinder fill is kind of in between, and I think that's where these kind of systems shine, right? Is that they're good at narrative, they're also good at pseudo. Wargaming is probably not the best term, but tactical, strategy games, I guess. They kind of have the best of both worlds without going full on in either direction. And I think when you start to shoehorn either type in, like whether a full-on war game or a full-on narrative RPG into Pathfinder and D&D, you start to run into a lot of issues. And I think that, it's why we often say it's best to pick a system that fits the kind of game you're going for, whatever that kind of game is. But where I was going with this is that, regardless, creativity and critical thinking are kind of something that players of D&D and Pathfinder are expected to possess and employ. And if you're not capable of doing that, you're probably not going to have fun in these kind of games, no matter how you're playing it, right? Because even combat aside, even just solving social encounters, role-playing encounters, they all require some degree of this critical thinking. And again, not everyone is good at that, and that's fine. And that's why other types of RPGs exist. Like Fate and it's not an RPG, but if you're looking for the more wargaming stuff, you have things like Warhammer, as they always said. So if I guess pulling it all back, I don't think that the book should just be flat out, in this situation you do this, in this situation you do this. Here's the optimal way to play our game, right? No, it's a rule book, not a strategy guide, right? Like it's giving you here's the things you can do, here's the things you can't do. It's up to you how to you do what you're trying to do, right?
John, do you have anything you don't like about the 3-action economy?
I don't think it's fundamental 3-action economy. I do think that Paizo went a little too overboard in worrying that people were going to stack too many bonuses and just create these like massive hits that were just going to wreck everything. I do like I mentioned previously in the episode that I had a discussion with one of our friends about how like flat-footed was a bit overused and how like it felt like everything was a circumstance bonus, so you couldn't really stack a lot of things in a lot of situations. I do kind of somewhat share some of those opinions in that I do feel like Paizo were a little too worried about people, stacking too much stuff and breaking the game. I feel like they could have laxed a little bit in that regard. But again, I don't think that's anything to do with the 3-action economy. I think that's or like at a fundamental level, I think that's just the implementation they chose with conditions and whatnot was probably not the best decision, or at least not the decision I would have taken as a designer. Um, but there's always homebrew.
That's the spice of gaming right there. That's what we're here for.
What about you? Is there anything you dislike about like the system itself?
Um, from the three action economy, I really don't like the companion rule sets. I
Oh,
feel like we
interesting.
throw our own ideas for sure.
I love.
I
I mean,
feel like
I haven't heard this opinion yours, so I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on that.
I feel like the action economy is so far away, and you when I first picked up the game, I felt no motivation to have a familiar. I felt no motivation to really have a companion. One of the first times I used it, I had was it Chompy in
Mm-hmm.
as a druid in one of your games,
Yep.
and I was I was instantly conflicted with. I feel like you're penalized for having a companion, and I think that one of the things that kind of makes druid, ranger, and the like classes shine the most is that if they can get away with using some of those extra things, I think that's what kind of like what sets them apart and kind of scales them above the rest of the other classes.
Right.
And when you take away the power from a familiar or a companion, then you're basically saying like, hey, your class could have been really good, but we're gonna nerf it. And it was really obvious that it was nerfed from the beginning. And it took, I don't want to say maybe 2 years before I finally found like optimal builds for a familiar. But because they hadn't released the witch yet,
Yeah.
and I now that I have a witch in my back pocket, I don't feel like I could run a familiar on any other class unless
Yeah.
I archetype witch or playing witch, and it's so kind of
So
frustrating
I
because I
can't
feel like
speak too
I
much
can
to familiars because I haven't really used them or seen them used much in my games beyond like just having it there. Like right, like I've like oh, forget the Fully, I think is the character's name in Shifting Sands, who has the bird familiar. And
yes.
he's used it a couple times in like sitting it off for recon, but typically in combat it just kind of sits there and doesn't really do anything. So I don't have much experience with familiars, but animal companions, I do agree that it's really easy to screw up an animal companion build. And I do agree that unless you are going full on, like focusing on animal companions, you're probably better off not taking them. Because if you don't if you don't take all the feats to like completely continuously boost your animal companion, it falls off in usefulness really quick. Even if you are using an action every turn, you're probably going to be missing a lot. It's probably not going to have a lot of HP. It's probably going to not have a high AC. So it's just unless you're like really dedicated to the animal companion, like really want to play a Beastmaster type character, then I don't feel like it's worth your time and feats. But if you do build it right, I feel that animal companions can be extremely, extremely powerful. But like you said, it takes very specific builds to do that. Actually, one of the homebrews I want to do is not a beast master, a beast tamer. Somebody who doesn't just have a dedicated animal companion, but somebody who can tame an animal in the wild for a temporary amount of time, and somebody who can use items to quote unquote summon a specific type of creature for a temporary amount of time. Somebody whose idea is built entirely around utilizing animals, not like monsters, but animals to kind of aid them in their party, right? I haven't figured out the specifics yet, but I think that idea is really cool and what in my mind I envision a Beastmaster as.
Hmm. I think the last thing that I have issue with the three action economy was the lack of reactions.
Yep, AOS.
I want
Yep, those spells totally exist, and I thought about just using those verbatim, but for the reasons you just put there, you said it only works. He said tame is a spell, but it only works with domesticated animals, and summon X also exists. But they, like you said, they do have their limitations, and maybe I'll use them, maybe I'll augment them, maybe I'll just use something else entirely. I don't know yet. I haven't had time to really sit down and focus on that, so I don't know how to look in the end. But I don't know. I think there's a place there for such a class or an archetype or something, right? Um, Homebrew greater tame could be. Again, I haven't really thought too hard on it yet, so we'll see how it ends up when I get there.
So I guess it's time to go into the outro, John.
Yeah, we could do that. So
Like, subscribe.
yeah, definitely like, subscribe. You see us on YouTube. Also, I did recently, just the other day, do a test stream on YouTube using YouTube streaming. We did a. It was only like, well, it was like an hour in total, but unfortunately, because there's a storm going on and my power cut out, and the way YouTube streaming works, it ended up unintentionally getting broken up in two parts. So you have like two 30-minute segments. But regardless, I thought it worked pretty well. And Jack and I still need to discuss whether or not we're going to move to YouTube streaming. There's a lot of benefits in doing so, but there's also a lot of things Twitch offers if we ever grow to the point where we can unlock those things that I don't think YouTube currently supports. So we need to weigh our options there and see like what we think. We've mentioned a lot in this episode Shifting Sands, which is our West Marches style Pathfinder 2e game. It has its own dedicated Discord. We'll have the link to that in the description on YouTube as well. I believe the link is actually the link for Shifting Sands might not be in our Twitch bio. I'll have to go back and check that. I don't think it's in our link tree either, so I'll add that there. But
it's an apply thing. Hit us up on our Discord on
the Art of Gamemastery.
And John or I will do a real quick, check and get you into the game if you're looking. We recently just added some new players. Looks like we'll be playing Sunday.
That's the plan. Yep.
So we'll be starting a fresh level 1. So if you're interested in getting in on a level 1 Pathfinder game, hit us up.
And again, like being West Marches style, it's not like a once a week or once a month we get there and play. It's like, no, it's like as players, you decide when you want to play, you figure out which characters you want to play. You can have multiple, what levels that is. You get a hold of me, or maybe in the future when we get bigger, we'll have more GMs, and we'll get a game going. So, if you're interested in that kind of stuff, definitely hit us up. We're always looking for more players. Jack has a number of games they're running and or putting together right now. I think you got a 5e game in the works, right, Jack?
I've got a 5e coming soon to my animal rights advocates. So we'll be doing a vegan 5th edition. We have our regular Pathfinder on Tuesdays.
Yep, which is really kind of on a hiatus right now, but I think coming back in a week or two, right?
We are in we're on a temporary hiatus, but not for any of those reasons, because I'm running a Call of Cthulhu game. That game was supposed to be short, and it's going a lot longer than I anticipated.
Hey,
right? I can't plan for anything. I wasn't expecting that.
I thought I'd be able to do a Fate one shot. Look how that turned out.
Hey, the Fate shot we're gonna make happen. We gotta get back. We gotta get back into that.
Yeah, we gotta get a episode 2 and 3 going on that at some point.
Holiday seasons are coming up, which means we're either gonna be super busy, or we're going to have a ton of free time on our hands. I don't think between John and I's schedules for just work in general, we can even predict
that. Companion. So we talked a little about companions in today's stream. I'd mentioned in the past that I was working on some what I call follower companion homebrews, which are like humanoid companions, right? And so those were mostly finalized. And then I did this stream on YouTube, and I started to work up a new companion, and I realized some holes and some issues with my approach. So I've gone back and revised the copy for the article that we're releasing on that, to change up some of those things. And I'm just Jack, whenever they get around to reviewing it and editing it, I have the example stat block all up and going now. So hopefully get that out to you soon. I think
it's the ball's in my court. I totally dropped the ball this week. I got to finish up.
I mean, like I said, I've been slacking on this for way too long anyway, so it's not a problem.
I don't think it's either of our faults, because work, I'm pretty sure for you, has been pretty hectic. We're both working overtime these days. For the next episode, John, are we covering one shots or sandbox? What was the one we were covering next?
I don't know. You brought out a lot of really good options. I haven't been able to sit down and think.
One shots or sandbox?
Yeah, so let us know what you want. And if you're watching this on YouTube, put it in the comments so we can get a little poll going. I do want to point out too, is for homebrew wise, the next thing I'll be working on after the Fall Companions is the stronghold rules. So like having your own domain, having your own stronghold, whatever. building it up over time, adding additions like adding new rooms and things like that, downtime activities from that, recruiting people to work the stronghold, etc. So that'll be a big one, and something haven't quite nailed down like the actual mechanics for yet. So I'm still working on that. So it'll be a little bit of time before we get that out there. Jack, are you working on any homebrew stuff right now that you want to toss out there?
Homebrew stuff, no. I'm busy building up a bunch of campaigns right now.
That's technically homebrew, right?
Yes. I'm finalizing Bree, the city Bree. We played that in what was that show that we went to?
Gen Con?
Gen Con. So I'm taking what we did with Gen Con. I'm trying to turn it into a virtual platform, kind of digitize it. So I'm working on that right now. I have a Blades in the Dark campaign I've been building a lot of stuff for.
Super excited for that.
I'm designing the raid for Tagasia. So yeah, I've got a heap of stuff on my plate right now.
Sweet.
I need to get to the next piece of artwork so that I can get it out to my artist, Ashley View, who is like, you can see the art in the background. Bree is going to burn and become debris. Wow.
Come debris. Bree is going to burn and become debris.
Oh my god.
Debris. Sounds like a rapper name. Like Debrat. Sorry.
Debris. It's for those, yeah, right?
Halo said roll for reflex.
I said roll for reflex.
Oh, you did. Yeah, you're right. You tagged Ayla. Sorry.
He said he did the sandbox shot because we asked, do you want sandbox or do you want one shots for us to cover? And they said, what about a
one sandbox shot?
One sandbox shot. That sounds like
that would be a nightmare to run. A sandbox and a one shot. I feel like it'd be like herding cats.
You'd think it's a one shot, but it would not hurt. It would not be that way.
Yeah.
You can't run a sandbox and pretend it's going to be. It's not working. Does it mean I could succeed? I don't know. Hey, don't forget to check us out. We're on. John does a lot of effort, puts these videos on YouTube with the intro. We're working on an outro right now, in addition to all that other stuff I told you we were doing.
Yep.
Also, we're on Odyssey, and because we're kind of like a podcast, you can check us out on Spotify.
We're technically on a lot of other podcast networks as well. We go through Anchor FM, which is Spotify's podcast service. In addition to Spotify, they broadcast this to a bunch of stuff, but most of which I've never even heard of before. So if you're a podcast fiend and you've got your own podcast service of choice, we're probably on there somewhere. Anchor has a ton of different services it puts us on. So, and Instagram is the other one to cover. We keep saying this and we keep dropping the ball on it, but we really need to start making the Instagram more useful. We want to start clipping out parts of the.
I made a meme. Didn't I make a meme? Or did I not? I never finalized that meme, did I?
You did not finalize the meme yet, no. But we want to start posting more memes. We want to start posting some like clipped out segments of finding paths and other videos we do. We want to start doing other videos in general. We are trying to grow. We are two people with not a lot of free time on our hands, so we're trying to do the best we can do. But so bear with us. I promise we'll get there eventually.
Thank you all for participating, joining us in the chat.
Yeah, thanks for commenting and joining in the chat. And Discord's been growing, which has been awesome. We've getting a lot more action in there as well, so love to see it. As usual, if there's any particular finding paths videos or just general game mastery videos you want to see us do, don't hesitate to request them in the Discord or in the YouTube comments, and we will try to fit those into the schedule somewhere. I think that's all we got, though. So until next time, happy gaming.
See you guys next week. Bye.